Hi, good morning everyone. It's a pleasure to be back at one of the Sustainability Live events and in person as well, now that we've emerged from that remote world. I'm very excited to be able to talk to you today about some evolutions in carbon reporting. So over at UL, I've been helping companies manage their carbon reporting for quite a while. And in recent years, really some transformative changes occur to the accuracy that companies need to bring to that carbon picture. So we're going to talk a little bit about that evolution of that standards, the role that UL Solutions has played in the companies that we support, and really look as well what the impact of that changes are and how companies can take action. I won't do that by myself. We actually will have Sophie here in a bit talking about the food beverage example as well, and really rounding out with hopefully a very motivated audience that can take some tangible actions away to your organizations. So, before going into all that, I wanted to understand a bit more about who knows UL. And I'm not sure here if UL Solutions is a familiar name to the audience, if it looks fairly new. Don't think that many people have heard of it before. So UL has been around for more than 125 years. And the mission really has been to create a safer world. Now, back in the day, that was very much focused on product certification, testing, and verification. But in recent decades, creating a safer world really encompasses sustainability and climate risk as well. And so over the years, we've really developed a strong sustainability pillar within UL, focusing on product safety, responsible sourcing, sustainable reporting platforms, as well as building out some strong partnerships with, for example, CDP, SASB, TCFD, and so forth. So speaking a little bit more about UL's evolution in carbon reporting and what we've seen there. So we've seen the emergence of the greenhouse gas protocol, and I'm sure carbon reporting in the previous sessions has also already been mentioned. So here, with the emergence of the greenhouse gas protocol, that very first version was more focused on companies really measuring and reporting their carbon emissions. And then there were some incremental changes to that. And so at UL, we very much focused on giving companies the tools to do that measurement, accurately drilling down where carbon emissions occur within their organization and reporting that to stakeholders. However, since the mid-late 2010s, measuring was simply not enough anymore. There's a couple of drivers that we'll talk about later that really forced companies to shift from just measuring to really a reduction and taking action. And there we've seen the emergence of science-based target setting, a tool for helping companies get that framework for getting to carbon reduction, as well as the emergence of these industry guidances that really allow companies to drill down much more specifically within their organization to get a more accurate carbon picture. And that is where, at UL, we're sort of developing as well the advisory and the assurance services to really help companies do a lot more than just measure, but really allow them to take action and to align with these new and emerging standards out there. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these triggers for change, starting with the emergence of new scopes. And I think this is something that some of the previous sessions talked about as well. So what the GHG protocol does, and what it does really well, is that it gives companies a framework to start categorizing where in the organization and where in the value chain activities are that incur carbon emissions. And when we look at scope 1 and 2, we very much look at the operational side of emissions, the electricity usage in your buildings, your vehicle fleet, and so forth. But one of these shifts and one of this evolution in carbon reporting has forced companies to pay a lot more attention to what occurs in the value chain. And that value chain is what we call then the scope 3 emissions. And so it forces companies as well to widen the lens of that carbon reporting and look at your suppliers, your procurements, how customers use your products, transportation, and so forth. So that attention to new scopes is really that emergence in the latest carbon reporting, as well supported by, for example, the Science-Based Target Initiative, which requires companies now to not just look at your own operational emissions, but also get a full value chain picture. A second trigger for that evolution is the strengthening of certain drivers, needing companies to take carbon reporting more into account and also do more accurate reporting. Some of those drivers are the new regulations emerging. These can be geographically linked, and I don't want to mention the whole alphabet soup, I often call it, as carbon reporting, with things like TCFD, CSRD, SEC, but also investors. Investors as well, who often now with the term ESG, require companies to get to investment-grade reporting on carbon and other ESG-related topics. One of the other triggers is new technologies, and this offers quite a lot of opportunities. So it is actually possible to get a more accurate data picture together and a more accurate vision of the carbon activities in your organization. When we think of new technologies in buildings, smart meters and so forth allow companies to get much more visibility on things like energy usage and therefore carbon emissions, but also things like telemetry in vehicles or even outside of carbon wearables for employee safety. So that new technology really opens doors for companies to get a more accurate data picture together, not just on carbon, but on wider sustainability-related topics. We then have new science, so the more we learn, the more we realize that action needs to be taken faster, and that simply measuring carbon is no longer sufficient. Companies need to start reducing and need to start reducing faster, and this is very apparent as well when we look at some of the details in the Science-Based Target Initiative. So all of these evolutions have really given a lot of opportunity to carbon reporting, and some of these opportunities we see being taken by industry standards and industry bodies, really looking at how do we give companies a framework to more accurately capture their carbon emissions. And that has been translated, and we see that here. So we have the emergence of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It's a great starting guide for knowing and understanding how we calculate carbon, but it was more a one-size-fits-all. And once we start looking at drilling down accurate carbon reporting within companies' value chains, that one-size-fits-all no longer meets all the purposes, because for every industry, the buildup of the value chain is inherently different. And so certain of these industry guidances, and REP is the one that Sophie will talk about, but also in finance with PCAF, in transportation with GLEC, really tried to give companies that framework tailored to their value chain that allows them to chase more accurate data for their carbon reporting. And we've talked about data a bit. So what is carbon data, or how is a carbon report made up? So we see that here in chasing down more accurate activity data, really the activities within your value chain that incur carbon, and then applying what we call an emission factor, translating that activity into something that relates to tons of CO2e. And so these industry guidances really drill down and give companies a more accurate opportunity to capture that data. Now, how can companies now equip themselves to do that? Because we talk about chasing down more data, that takes more time, more effort. We're talking about looking at the value chain. It's harder to get access to data in your value chain. So there's a couple of things that companies can do really to equip themselves and get ready for this transformative change and really for that higher level of carbon reporting. And the first one is the people aspect. Of course, we can have the fanciest databases all around. If we don't have the right people engaging with them, turning data into knowledge, understanding what carbon means to your organization and to your value chain, and be mobilized to join that carbon journey with you, we might encounter some obstacles. So having a value chain, not just your own organization, but your value chain engaged and mobilized on a joint carbon journey is key. Secondly, there's the processes. So sustainability or carbon reporting is no longer a standalone picture or pillar within an organization. To really drive meaningful action across your value chain, your sustainability processes should be embedded within your wider business processes. An example here is, for example, procurement. If we say we need to get a carbon picture from our supply chain, a way to do that would be to embed carbon as a topic in your wider procurement policies and really work with procurement as a key stakeholder on that. And then the third one is technology. So with a lot of digitization of sustainability and software solutions out there, it offers a great opportunity to capture more data. But then again, more data does not automatically mean more qualitative reporting. So we really got to make sure we focus on the right data points, interpreting them in the right way, and using them to drive informative decision-making on carbon reduction. So with these things in mind, I'd love to hand it over to Sophie, who will give us an accurate example of the food and beverage industry. So at REP, recently developed one of these industry standards. And so Sophie will talk to us a little bit more about what that standard means and how they've been piloting that with companies and what we can learn from that.
Thank you. Right, thanks everyone. So before I start, I'm going to do a really quick introduction to RAP. So we are a sustainability charity. We focus on 3 key areas being textiles, food and drink, and plastics. Our main activity is managing voluntary agreements for these different industry areas, and our flagship agreement is Untitled 2030. This agreement sets out really ambitious targets for the food and drink sector as a whole in the UK. So we're aiming to have 50% reduction in food waste by 2030, 50% reduction in GHG emissions associated with the production of food in the UK, and also 50% of fresh food to be sourced from high water stewardship management areas by 2030 again. So we don't do this alone. We work with organisations all across the food and drink sector. So over 100 organisations spanning all the different subsectors. We've got the trade bodies, we work with policy as well. So there's a lot of people involved in our work and involved in the work that we convene. We can't fit everybody on the screen here, but here's a snapshot of some of the companies we work with. So our work at RAP around GHGs is very much focused on Scope 3 supply chain emissions. And why did we come into this space? So a lot of large food and drink businesses have all set targets on their GHG emissions, and a lot of these include Scope 3. And now we're all facing the same challenge of how do they actually robustly track the progress towards these targets. Because there's so many different companies facing the same challenge but not working together, there's been a proliferation of different approaches taken, which is resulting in quite a lot of inconsistency throughout the sector. We've also seen a huge demand on the suppliers at the lower end of the supply chain, with different data requests from all the different customers, all the different timeframes, different scopes, asking different questions, which is really a very time-consuming exercise. And we also had, this proliferation different approach has meant there's a lack of consistency, made this uneven playing field, and we couldn't see any forum which was bringing these different bodies together to talk about this progress in the same place. So what have we done about it? We have published a suite of Scope 3 materials. So we've published a large technical document, which I'll go into more detail on the next slide. And we've also published a pilot set of supplier GHG questions for key product types. So this is a set of questionnaires that different food and drink companies can use, all publicly available. So different food and drink companies can use these question sets, and they include questions that either inform product footprinting or actually ask questions that we can't quantify the positive impact of yet, but catalyses movement in the right direction. So for example, with your coffee producers, asking if they're sourcing from Rainforest Alliance certified plantations. So questions that either give you a product footprint or catalyse action in the right direction. And by using this power of one voice, we're aiming to reduce the burden on the suppliers at the bottom of the supply chain, but also push data collection and action in the right way. We've got a shorter summary document because not everybody has the time to read our long technical document, and this is very much a how-to guide for this larger document. And most recently, we have published an emission factor data sheet. So as Evelyne just mentioned, emission factors are highly used in Scope 3 in the place of supplier-specific data, because that's very hard to get hold of. But there is a lot of inconsistencies in these emission factors. So they are not always clear whether they include land use and change, not always clear whether they include packaging, and also not always clear what geography and what functional unit, i.e. like kilogram of beef or kilogram of live weight. So we brought these all into one place and added these extra layers of clarity in what is actually included in the emission factor, and some overall data quality scores for the various databases. So, as I was saying, our main flagship document out of these is our Scope 3 protocols, and we haven't reinvented the wheel in any way with this document. We've taken globally existing guidance, pulled it all into one place, and added extra layers of recommendations and requirements, and also practical steps on how to actually get started on this journey. By doing this, we're hoping to get a consistent definition of measurement and boundaries, consistent data sources and methods of validations, and also that consistent means to demonstrate progress. We're aiming for this protocol to be the measurement approach taken by the food and drink sector, and eventually, hopefully, inform policy as well. So the next step for our Scope 3 suite, as always, we're not doing this alone. We are involving industry, and we have these companies up on the screen who will be stress testing the Scope 3 suite with us, making sure they're the most usable they can be, making sure that they are accessible and actually will drive action. Because overall, we want to get this consistency in measurement and accounting so that we can move past this stage and actually get on to tangible actions in the supply chain, reducing emissions. So I'm going to pass back over to Evelyne, who will go into some more tangible actions.
Thank you, Sophie, for that example. Okay, so hopefully what we've taken away already up to now is that these industry standards can be a real tool for companies to increase the accuracy and the width of their carbon reporting. So how does a company like UL help our clients do that is we take them through a couple of steps to really embark on this journey together. And whether you are new to carbon reporting or whether you have already certain experience or some legacy in carbon reporting, but you say, hold on, it's time to reinvent, to widen the lens and really increase the accuracy, these steps would apply to both. So on the first hand, there's mobilizing your value chain. So not only your organizations, but making sure that carbon reporting is not a sustainability department isolated responsibility. It's something that will require various of your stakeholders, internal and external, to really be engaged on this journey. Then we come to measure, making sure that we understand what industry standards, what data do we have, how do we measure, and what does carbon mean to our company? Because of course, guidance is out there, they have a great starting point, but ultimately every organization has a unique culture, a unique DNA. So how can we make the most of carbon reporting by ensuring that the way we measure carbon speaks to our organization and uses the processes, the tools, the strengths that we as an organization have? When we come to manage, so if we have done mobilize and measure right, we can identify, based on the quality of the data we've collected, how can we start driving reduction. Driving reduction can be a little bit easier in your own organization. You own your own buildings, your own operations, but we also need to look at how can we drive reduction in our value chain. On the one hand with suppliers or mobilizing customers and clients to use products differently, dispose of them differently. And there it can be a little bit more challenging. But if we've done that mobilized action right, we can re-engage with those stakeholders to drive reduction together. Then comes report. So we've mentioned this a little bit with certain drivers for reporting. Your investors, your stakeholders, regulators, and so forth will want you to disclose investment-grade carbon data. And to help with data being investment-grade on carbon, we can also offer certain assurances services. So really taking the same kind of auditing lens that we might do to financial data onto your carbon reporting. And that is key. The more of these frameworks that emerge there, the more benchmarks there are there and checks that can be done to make sure that carbon methodologies, carbon reporting in your organizations are done in the right way and align with these standards. So mobilize and measure as key elements to get started on and key areas to really embark and study what industry guidance is out there. How can we turn that into an opportunity for our organization and adapt it to what speaks well to us? And so over at UL, we've done that with a couple of companies. So UL has a very global and industry-agnostic outreach. We have companies at the starting journey of carbon reporting, keeping it light, simple, and pragmatic, because no one can go from 0 to 100 in day one. So the important part is to get started. It's not important to get all the nuts and bolts right. It really is a journey. So if we start in a place that makes sense, and we remain agile and pragmatic throughout that, you can mature that carbon journey, you can become more and more accurate, take into account more standards and dive into some of the more complexities like Scope 3. So we're at the end. I'll hand it over to questions in a little bit, but hopefully what we've taken away today is that there's a lot of opportunity out there to really accelerate and become more accurate in carbon reporting, and not just in your organization, but across your value chain. And these industry standards really help pull those elements together so that you have an industry-specific view of what you can do. And then hopefully it also shows that we will be stronger if we work together. So carbon reporting really should be looked at from an industry perspective. A lot of companies might share the same suppliers, might share a similar value chain. So what these industry guidances help to facilitate as well is that shared conversation for how can we do this together. Because if every company on their own tries to drill down into their value chain and do that, as standalone, we might not get there as efficiently and as good as we can. So that was that. Thank you so much. And I think we have time for some questions.
Yeah, I think we've got a few minutes, some questions, but thank you first to Evelyne and Sophie. Any questions from the floor? You know the format by now. Throw a hand up. If we get a mic over there, please, Tom. Just keep your hand up. We'll come to you in a second. I'm just going to take one of the questions we've had come in. Actually, Sophie, I'll turn to you first, literally. So having developed the food and beverage standard, what advice would you give to other industries that are trying to develop their own standards?
So the first one would be to not underestimate the task. It's a big job. But the most important step in all of it is consulting industry, making sure they are involved in the decisions, making sure you're not duplicating anything, because it's a very crowded, loud, noisy space. We don't need extra guidance where it's not needed. So listen to industry. If it's something needed and doesn't exist, then go for it, essentially.
Okay, good. I like that answer. Okay, if you just start by stating your name and where you're from, please.
Hi, my name is Rebecca. I work at a design company, and I was quite interested in the end point you made about being collaborative. And I just wanted to ask your opinion on transparency of data. I think one thing I've been struggling is that we are measuring, but then because everyone keeps their data secret, everyone has a different carbon software, and there's no baseline in industries to be able to understand, like, as a design company, what are the other design companies doing? And yeah, so what have you been finding with transparency and carbon and big companies, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and you've really hit the nail on the head with the challenge, because we can advocate for more accurate reporting, more data, more tooling needed, but especially when you look at the value chain, if every company does that by themselves, we're going to have hundreds of surveys to fill in and needing 5 full-time people, only answering data questions and putting data points together. So what we try to do is across the companies that we work with, we try to bring customers in similar industries together. So we try to learn, make sure that we facilitate a culture where they can be learned from each other. And I think what the industry guidance really allows us to do is, as well as facilitate what Sophie mentioned with those pilot companies, is create a culture for that sharing. And what's happening more and more, but this really requires companies to drop some of those barriers and willing to engage in a shared conversation. But there are a couple of industry bodies, I'm thinking about the railway industry in Europe, as well as some chemical industry bodies, that really come together and say, let's not each individually look at our own carbon reporting software. Let's try and do that as a joint exercise across our industry. And I think more of that is needed, but I think it will take companies to be willing to share, drop some of those barriers, and see the opportunities and the efficiencies in that sharing in order to really get there.
Okay, thank you for your question. We're going to leave it there. So thank you to Evelyne and to Sophie.